Praise be to God. Today's Bible reading portion is from the new book, that is Joshua. We're going to be meditating on chapters from Joshua, chapters 1 to 6. Now, in the previous book of Deuteronomy, we could see on how God ordains Joshua to take up the leadership in leading the people of Israel. The book of Joshua talks about how God commissions Joshua as a leader of Israel. Chapter 1 verses 1 to 9 speaks on how Moses died on top of Mount Pisgah and was buried by God. And after his death, God spoke to Joshua and told him to prepare to take the Israelites across the Jordan River. God promised to give Israel the land west of the Jordan, from the wilderness to the Euphrates River, and from the land of the Hittites to the Great Sea. God assured Joshua that no opposing army would be able to defeat Israel because the Lord fought for them. He encouraged Joshua to be strong and very courageous and to keep the laws of God on his mind continually. Verses from 10 to 19 talks on how Joshua prepares the people for the river crossing. Calling the officers of the people to himself, Joshua instructed them to go through the camp and prepare the people to cross the Jordan River within 3 days. Joshua reminded the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half-tribe of Manasseh that, although they had decided to live east of the Jordan, they needed to keep their word and help their countrymen conquer the land west of Jordan. The men from 2.5 tribes confirmed to Joshua that they would keep their word and help their brothers fight until all the land was acquired. Moving on to chapter 2, Joshua's 2 spies meet Rahab in Jericho. Now Joshua sent 2 spies across the Jordan River to spy out the land and the city of Jericho. After entering Jericho, the spies went into a prostitute's house, and the prostitute's name was Rahab. That evening, it came to the attention of Jericho's king that the spies had entered his city and were seen going into Rahab's place. When the king's men arrived to question Rahab, she told them that the spies exited the city just before the gate closed and that if they hurried, they could catch up with them. In reality, Rahab had hidden the spies on her roof to protect them. As the king's men raced to catch them, Rahab went up to the roof to speak with them and asked them to spare her and her family when Israel came to conquer Jericho. She said that she had heard about the great works of God and she feared the Lord of Israel. All the Canaanites feared Israel because they had heard about their Red Sea crossing, which we could see in Exodus chapter 14, and their defeat on the kings Sihon and Og. The spies promised to save her and anyone in her house when they came to conquer Jericho. They told her to tie a scarlet cord in her window so that the army would know which house was hers. The text tells us that her house was connected to the city wall, which allowed her to get spies out of the city even when the gates were closed. The 2 spies hid in the hills for 3 days before returning to Joshua. From that, moving on to chapter 3, we can see Israelites' miraculous crossing of the Jordan. Joshua led Israel from Shittim to the banks of the Jordan River where they made the camp. And after 3 days, the officers told the Israelites to follow the Ark of the Covenant when they saw it passing through the camp. They were to follow the Ark at a distance of 2,000 cubits, and it would guide them to the location of the river crossing. Before they crossed the river, Joshua told the people to cover themselves because the Lord was going to work miracles amongst them. When the time for the crossing arrived, Joshua, at the Lord's instruction, told the priests to carry the Ark of the Covenant into the Jordan River. The water downstream continued flowing until the river bed was dry. Joshua told the people this miracle was to be a sign to them that the living God was among them and he would not fail to give them the promised land. All Israel crossed over the Jordan on dry ground. The priest remained in the river with the Ark of the Covenant until the entire congregation was on the west bank of the river. Adding on to that, in chapter 4, we can see that Israelites crossed Jordan and set up 2 memorials. In Joshua chapter 3, God supernaturally dried up the riverbed of Jordan River to allow the Israelites to cross to the west bank. In chapter 4, it picks up when the crossing was nearly complete. When all the Israelites were safely on the west side of the river, God told Joshua to have 1 man from each tribe to go back to the riverbed and take a stone from the place where the priest stood with the Ark of the Covenant. The stones were to be carried to the place where the Israelites would make camp. When this was complete, Joshua went to the river and selected 12 stones of his own. He set the stones up in the river to mark the location of the miraculous crossing. The Bible tells us that the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel on the day of crossing, and they stood in awe of him just as they stood in awe of Moses. When everything was complete, Joshua was told by God to have the priest who carried the Ark of the Covenant exit the river. As soon as their feet touched the river bank, the water of the river returned to its normal state. The people camped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. Joshua took the 12 stones carried by the 12 tribal representatives and set them in Gilgal. He told the Israelites the stones would stand as a memorial for future generations of God's miracle at the Jordan River. From that, we move to chapter 5, where fear spreads through the land of Canaan. This happens when the kings of the Amorites and the Canaanites heard about God's miraculous helping that Israel were able to cross the Jordan River. They were all terrified. The text says their hearts melted and there was no longer any spirit in them. In chapter 5 verses 2 to 9 talks on the Israelite men that are circumcised. God told Joshua to make flint knives and circumcise the men in the camp. All the Israelite men who came out of Egypt were circumcised in the wilderness, but those born since that time had not been. Circumcision was a sign of God's covenant with his people. Verses 10 to 12 talks about the last manna and the first Passover. Israel crossed over the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month. They kept the feast of Passover on the 14th day of the first month. The day after, the Israelites started eating the food they found in the land. And the day after that, the manna, which God had been sending to Israel for 40 years, that stopped appearing on the ground every morning. Verses 13 to 15, here Joshua meets the commander of the Lord's army. When Joshua was near Jericho, he encountered a man with a drawn sword standing in front of him. He asked the man if he was an ally or an enemy, and the man told him that he was the commander of the army of the Lord, and told Joshua to remove his sandals because he was standing on the holy ground. Joshua immediately fell on his face and started worshipping the Lord. While all this happens, as we move to chapter 6, God continues to give his instructions for conquering Jericho. Now, the city of Jericho was entirely closed off in anticipation of an attack by the Israelites. Here, God spoke to Joshua and told him that he was to give Israel victory. God instructed the Israelite warriors to march around the city one time for 6 days in a row. 7 priests blowing trumpets made from ram's horns were to accompany the warriors, and on the 7th day the priest and the warriors were to march around the city 7 times. And when the 7th time was complete, the priests were to blow a long blast on the trumpet, and the walls of Jericho would fall. In chapter 6, verses from 6 to 27, talks about the great conquering of the Jericho. Joshua gave the Lord's instructions to his army and arranged the marching procession. The procession was led by the armed men, followed by the 7 priests, followed by the Ark of the Covenant and the rear guard. The army was to remain silent as they marched. They were only allowed to speak when Joshua gave the order to shout. Joshua told the people that everything in the city was designated for destruction and they were not to take any spoil. For 6 days, the army circled Jericho one time before returning to the camp. And on the 7th day, they marched around the city 7 times. The priests blew a long blast on the trumpet. Joshua gave the order to shout, and the walls of Jericho fell down flat. When Jericho was exposed, the Israelites ran into the city and destroyed everything except for Rahab and her gathered in her house. Israel burned the city, and Joshua cursed it with the following words: "Cursed before the Lord is the man who rises up and builds this city Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn, he will lay its foundation, and with the loss of his youngest son, he will set up its gates." In this chapter, we could see the great conquering of the Jericho wall. And that sums up chapter 6 on how the Israelites and the army conquered the wall of Jericho. I hope it was useful to all. Thank you again for listening, and God bless.